This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its nominal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. All right, this is Modern Gamer Culture for fourth episode, Modern Gamer Culture. Modern Gamer Culture is the show of cumulative information, meaning that you shouldn't, just start at whatever episode you feel like. If you start, watching Modern Gamer Culture, you should start from episode one, right? Um, or you're gonna find that, through listening to this show, you're gonna find it increasingly um, more difficult um, to listen to what I'm saying. So, first few episodes of Modern Game Culture, um, I've been kind of just, you know, um, sort of been like, I described it as, as a speaker, sort of, um, you know, vibe, right? Um, and I've talked about, striking a balance, between pace, temperance, delivery, personality, right? I think for this episode, I think I'm really going to be leaning more into, you know, temperance when it comes to the theme of this episode, right? You know, I really have to make sure that, with, you know, delivering, this show, right, that, I'm not really blowing smoke up people's ass. You Um, I want to cater to the people I'm trying to reach, right? At the same time, I also have to make sure, I'm not, blowing my lid, right? Um, because this material can get very heavy, right? And so I don't want to lead people off the path, so to speak, um, by blowing things out of proportion when I don't need to, right? So you know it, it's gonna be difficult, right? Because especially when it comes to um, this type of content, right? You're not going to really be able to reference a lot of this stuff, from other content creators, especially when it comes to this um, profession, internet radio, right? Um, so, you know, I'm not going to, propose a lot of, you know, topics of discussion, right? When understand that it's going to be very difficult to really even um, verify a lot of what I'm talking about. Right? This has to be formalized in a way where it's going to be palatable, right? Um, and it will be, um, you know, it will serve as the verification, right? You know, um, there's this culture of authoritarianism, right, that has really infected the West, in which unless you're wearing a lab coat and a stethoscope, you know, or unless you have a badge and a uniform, somehow your points are not valid, right? Or unless you're wearing a three-piece suit, your points are not valid, and you know that's not how you discover the veracity of you know something that you are trying to investigate. And so we'll talk about that on the show too. Generally this is known as the um, scientific method, right? um, or as part of a classical liberal arts education, would be referred to as a trivium, right? And then the quadrivium, right, which is quantification, of the trivium, right? And so, you know, it's not going to be something where I'm just going to just come on here and just be like, hey, did you hear about Ebola? You know, um, you know, this is something where I'm going to be trying to make sure that um, I can cover my tracks, so to speak, which is another very important part of participating in the gaming arena, right? Understanding that skill set, right? And so, um, you know, last episode was definitely very somber, right? I was pretty harsh, right? Um, and that's as harsh as you're gonna get it, right? Because these people don't really deserve, you know, these guys don't deserve anything more, right? And so, you know, I'm gonna try to reel that in a little bit for this episode, right? Really focus on really what I want to talk about, right? For these first few episodes, this was really just the internet censorship wave, the early 2010s, right? And how devastating it was to the field of internet radio, right? Because, on top of the fact that people lost their content, what we also got, right, was a whole audience of people, on the edge of their seats for the next, internet radio aficionado, right? And those people completely scattered to the four winds because they don't even have a, host, you know, to even transfer from, right? Um, Not to mention, not even having an archive of people's work, right? Um, Affecting, you know, um, the gauge, right, as well, right? You know, um, filling those shoes is not going to be a small feat, right? And so, you know, I understand that, you know, as influential as I seek to be, right? I also understand that, you know, um, we really have an audience to really reunite, right, under a banner, right? And I think that modern gamer culture um, should serve as that, banner. right? I would go as far as to say that, right? I feel like I've really, um, you know, fulfilled the requirements, right, for, um, you know, um, serving as that, internet radio aficionado, right? And so, you know, with the proliferation of modern gaming culture, you know, um, I also want to enter discussion, and be like, hey, well, I don't really think I'm going to have to, right? To be honest, I don't really want to speak so, confidently, right? Because again, I understand that this material is going to get very heavy, right? And it's going to be incredibly demanding, right? And so, as much as I understand that, I really want to, as part of modern gaming culture, reunite, that audience, right? Also understand that, you know, it's going to be like a little gauntlet, right? Where people are going to be eliminated, slowly, metaphorically. And so, you know, obviously, um, one step at a time, right? Um, so, it's something where I think I've really, exhausted that demon, so to speak, that will, come up and really envelop me. Um, that is my fury that I have for these internet radio show pundits, of the day, right? That's really I don't think have the solution at hand, right? Their points are not turning, um, and they're satisfied with just being comfortable, right? Having their needs met, right? And if you think that your needs met supersedes your love of freedom, I'll let you think about that. So you know, I think I want to introduce another topic that's going to really be a mainstay topic on this show, um, which is the role of internet publishing in you know um, this time we're living in, which I consider an internet dark age, right? Um, at this time, internet publishing, you know, quality internet publishing has never been more paramount, right? To turn in the tide of this internet dark age, right? Because of how accessible it is to really publish now on the internet, and a lot of these artificial structures that have really been formed through stuff like public school, right? And this bureaucracy, right? It's easier to reach people of all types, right? um if they're people that went to school with, right? Or people that you go to work with, or are part of some sort of union, and they follow you on social media. You just pull something, and you touched like 300 people, right? So even really lifting a finger, right? Um, it's something that it needs to be handled very responsibly, right? Um, you know, this show, right? Again, right? This shot is kind of messy, quite frankly, right? A lot of it's pretty chaotic shot, right? Um, and so I kind of highlighted that in that first episode, which again I covered, and I apologized for, because it was really just an outtake I was doing, but it still holds true, right? Production value aside, right? This show I prepared for months, right? And so you know, we'll talk about that on modern gaming culture, right? And its relationship to modern gaming culture. But you know, I mean, people are so unequipped to really take on, what I'm going to be calling the kinks of modern game culture, right? It's painful. It's painful for people, especially who are, taking up arms into the arena of internet publishing, right? Because it makes us have to um, cater to way larger of an audience than we normally would, right? And so, where we'd be able to really shine our talents, right, in very creative ways, right, we're forced to really stretch ourselves thin, right, um, and then also have to develop a large, colossal skill set with respect to that as well, right? No small feat, right? So if you think that somehow, I got, a bookshelf, chaotic bookshelf, right? Um, you know, what's this guy have to tell me, right? Again, right? It's a lot of that authoritarian culture really bleeded in to your assessment of my work. So you know, as much as I have to also um, remain credible, right? I also have to you know address people who may be having prejudices, right, about the quality of my operation, so to speak, and use that to discredit my work. I have to just point out a lot of those psychological biases that may be present while listening or watching, right? So, it's not going to be something I'm going to be making a big part of the show because, again, I know I have a lot of material that I really need to really formalize. So, it's not, I'm not going to just make the show about, you know, basically, a psychobabble fest, right? And so, um, it's never been more important to really be trying to put out a positive message, right? We have a lot of these sort of niche forms of internet culture, right? That are really been popping up with, a lot of these sentiments attached, right? You know, you have, a lot of indie pop subcultures, right? Um, putting together this meme of like um, poptimism, right? Sort of like a pun on the term, optimism, right? You know, recognizing how important it is to, um, publish, very positive, uplifting messages, right? With no strings attached, particularly. I think it's the most important part of what I'm trying to get into here, right? Um, you know, people want to be nice to people only if there's something that they're going to receive, as a result of being nice to people, right? You know, um, the saying "killing of kindness," right, really echoes with what I'm saying here, right? Um, and so people will seem to be, outwardly benevolent, but be a raven and wolf, right, behind sheep's clothing, right? And so everyone has a phone these days, right? You know, again, you guys are gonna get to know me, right? Through listening to the show, right? I was talking about, I think it was in the last episode, right, about sort of my experience in public school, right? You know, and so how a lot of things were deprived from me, right? Um, due to my socioeconomic status and just societal status in general, right? And another thing that was very difficult for me in public school was, you know, not really having as much as the average person, right? I say, everyone has a phone these days, right? But I have to qualify that because, again, right, you come onto the show, I'm not Anderson Cooper, all right? um, so I definitely have a lot of baggage I need to unpack, right? Um, and again, I'm not just going to air my dirty laundry just for the sake of airing out dirty laundry. So yeah, everyone has a phone, right? And so it's very easy to just basically do whatever you want on the internet. Right? The internet is a pretty much just this public forum, right? But you have to be very careful, right? And you know, um, developing a relationship with the internet, right? Um, something that's just very common. People are just ghosting people left and right, you know, cutting people off, right? Giving people, scathing rage, right? Um, and people are like struggling, seemingly, right? People just coming back, seeming more benevolent than they were the last time, right? Creating all these sort of dynamics that are really just invented, right? Like a lot of these things are not really. These are a lot of these are invented dynamics. Sort of this, you know, seeming, you know, um, remorseful soul returning, to the wronged um, party with like this divine decomposition of benevolence and penitence. um, I'm a poet. I'm a poet. What can I say? But these are not really real dynamics, right? These are a lot of these are just invented dynamics, right? And so, you know, um, it's just again, right? This technology is so powerful, right? But um, again, right? If you don't know how to use the internet, right, and the personal computer, it might as well just be sticks and stones, right? So imagine, the most vile creatures to ever have walked this earth, and they have the capacity to interface with anybody they want on the earth, literally at the snap of a finger. You can imagine what kind of damage that'll do, um, theoretically, right, psychologically, societally, right, um, etc., right, and otherwise, right. And so, you know, I think it's very important when it comes to understanding, how a lot of these things were getting alleviated, particularly through the field of internet radio, right? You know, people's relationship with internet publishing, right? Um, so this is something I feel like I'm getting into, formally, right? This is like probably going to be like a little bit of the first of the, you're going to see me try to do a little bit more formal presenting, right? So you know, buckle in, right? Buckle up, right? It's going to be a pretty wild ride, right? It's we go through, public school around these days, right? A lot of these people I'm trying to reach, right? These are people, whether you're like a young adult, 16 to 18 years old, right? And then, that, range, right? To around like 40 years old, right? We went through school, right? With the public computer, right? With the personal computer, right? Um, and, for some of these people, maybe a little later in their schooling, right? Um, with the personal computer, right, and the internet, right? And we're pretty much forced to develop, you know, a understanding of how the personal computer and internet works in order to get through, right? And so we think that somehow, again, with all the, also intertwined with this like authoritarian culture, right? We think that somehow um, that you know so-called education that we received, right, from public schools, right, is sufficient to tackling the problems that we identify and investigate, right, from day to day, right? And you're sorely mistaken. I mean, you know, there is like this psychological bias called the Dunning Kruger effect, right, where people with insufficient levels of knowledge, right, um, have you know uh, exaggerated confidence when it comes to their assessment of their intellect, right? Whereas people with a lot more knowledge have a very tempered, you know, um, pun intended, um, overview of their confidence when it comes to what they know, right? Um, and this psychological bias, known as the Dunning Kruger effect, right, is quite appropriate to discuss here um, when it comes to this topic, right? Um, you know, not only is public school not really a beacon of education, right? You know, um, when it gets to really diving deep into mastery of this technology, right? I mean, schools didn't even, they didn't even open the book, right? Let alone put a chink in the armor, right, of this Leviathan, right? So again, people who I'm really trying to reach, they understand, you know, but for the people who might be a little slow, on the uptake, you know, um, it's insufficient, right? And that's being very generous, right? It's actually laughable, right? To actually propose that you somehow develop the skill set related to the personal computer and the internet from public schools, right? It's a laughing joke, right? And you deserve ridicule and mockery for trying to espouse, those ideas, right? Um, you know, a lot of people, are putting together seminars and stuff like that to, alleviate a lot of, that technological illiteracy, right? Um, a lot of people, a lot better than others, for sure, right? But it doesn't take 5 minutes, to of a, you know, um, search inquiry on the internet to find people who are trying to, you know, enlighten people on, the internet, right? So, it's unacceptable to be this technologically illiterate when it comes to the people I'm talking about particularly, right? Understanding your relationship with the internet, right? Understanding your responsibility to publish very positive content on the internet, especially during this time of an internet dark age, right? Um, it's just unacceptable. And again, these people are all around us; they're in all our circles, right? Um, and they're doing damage, right? And they need to be spotlighted like the roaches they are. So that's about as um, heated as I'm going to get when it comes to talking to people because they don't really deserve any um, they don't deserve any notoriety at all. So for the people in the front who are actually trying to listen, right? Internet publishing when it comes to promoting positive messages has never been more tantamount to alleviating, the internet dark age which we find ourselves, right? Um, so I think I'll just leave it there for one part of this episode, right? To conclude, I think you know that was kind of just a taste of what a formal modern gaming culture uh, hosted uh, long form presentation would really kind of feel like, right? Again, the show doesn't represent me just turn on the camera and just point at myself and just say what's on my mind. Right? This is something I prepared for months in advance. So, uh, you should really get yourself into that receptive mode, right? When you're really going to tune into, later episodes of Modern Game Culture, and then also with, you know, long form presentation I might propose, right? Um, so, this episode I was getting a little witty for sure. Um, you know, again, right? I'm gonna talk. You guys are gonna get to know me. Um, you know, as you listen more to Modern Gamer Culture, right? Um, so you know, um, I also still want to get to know my audience, right? So I'm not going to try to, style on people, as we say around here, right? Um, flippantly. I want to reach people where they are and cater my material to them. Right? So, this has been Modern Gaming Culture. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you.